Welcome. I hate to cut off conversation at the beginning of spring break, but that's my task. I'm Gary Adler. I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies. And I wanted to start our afternoon off by asking you one question. Where were you at 1 a.m. this morning? Now, I know two people in this room have good answers. Myself, I was changing diapers of an 18-day-old. And our speaker, luckily for us today, was awake watching the new papal inauguration. So the rest of you just fill out slips. I'll collect them afterwards and determine what you were doing. So we've lucked out in who we have here today. A couple of things as we get started. We always record these so we can post these on our website afterwards. So after Peter's done with his presentation, we'll have some Q&A. We'll kind of let Peter navigate that, but I'll have the walk-around mic. And if you don't wait for the mic, you're silenced. You'll never make it onto the internet. So, maybe you'll talk quick before the mic gets to you. But do wait for that as it comes. A couple of technical things. If you have anything that resembles a device like this at all, please turn off ringers and that sort of thing. I'm going to take new father privileges, though, and leave mine on in case I get that call. And then as we complete our day today, I invite you to spend a little bit of time taking a look at our growing list of publications that we have out here in front of you. Everything is for sale except the banner. So if you want something, you can talk with Sheila Garrison, who's the person closing the door right now. And then also have a free book to give you as we leave today, to give you a sense of what the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, what we do when we're not gathered like this, what we're doing to foster research of, about, and for the Catholic tradition in a very broad sense of that term. So to introduce the person who will introduce Peter, I'd like to invite up Father Jim Heft. He is the president of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies and is the Alton M. Brooks Professor of Religion here at USC. Father Jim.
Just that you know, in relationship to what Gary just announced, I have 4 siblings, all of whom are married, all of them with children, and I have changed diapers too, so that you know that. So last night at 1 o'clock I was asleep, more or less. But it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here. I think it's a wonderful thing that we have these gatherings. It's a kind of service to the local communities. We have lectures 2, 3, even 4 a semester. And I'm especially delighted to see some people coming here from LMU. So we're very pleased to have them here as well. My task is very simple, and that is to introduce a colleague of mine, David Albertson, who has worked with Peter on a number of issues. Both of them are involved in studies of Nicholas of Cusa, who's a rather fascinating, somewhat eccentric, and certainly brilliant cardinal from the 15th century. And it was part of his own thinking that spearheaded the book that I edited with a Jewish scholar and a Muslim scholar. And it was a collection of essays that grew out of a seminar we held in Jerusalem some time ago on the subject of learned ignorance as it would affect interreligious dialogue. Once you understand the limits of your understanding, it opens the door for more understanding. It's also the end of fundamentalism. So that's a wonderful thing. So I'd like to invite David, who is a professor here at USC and a young father as well, who has changed his fair share of diapers, to introduce our speaker, Peter Casarella. Oops, I left my drink there. Oh. My lemonade, that's all.
Well, thank you, Father Heft. I'm very happy to be here. I'm also a member of the Generations in Dialogue group, which is one of the activities of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies. And we were able to hear from Peter in one of our previous meetings as well. But Peter and I have known each other for a couple years, working on some similar work in medieval studies. I was thinking about how to introduce Peter and someone of his academic renown and of the seriousness of his scholarship, and I thought, since it's spring break, and for those other reasons, we really should look at the arbiter and the real canon of how we judge scholarly seriousness today, which is, of course, ratemyprofessor.com. And one of the students there, this is okay, I thought twice about doing this because we're on video here, but it says, I want to read this to you. The student writes, "I'm a Catholic, and I learned more in his class than I did in my 19 years of attending church," capital C. "He is a Yale grad and a genius in field. You have to read a lot, and it can be confusing, but he explains everything well. He emails back even around 11 p.m. at times. He loves what he does and treats all students with respect," and the student concludes, "I would recommend him." So we're very happy to have Peter here on campus with us. Peter did earn 3 degrees at Yale and also spent 2 years in Germany studying at the Institute for Cusanus Research as one of the eminences there. He's taught at the universities of Dallas, Catholic University for 15 years, and since 2007, he is the professor of Catholic Studies at DePaul and also the founding director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. I would say that Peter is a Catholic, for those of us who know his scholarship, he's a Catholic scholar in both senses of the term, and also in the lowercase c sense of the term, that he works in a variety of fields. In medieval Christian thought, on Nicholas of Cusa, this important 15th century cardinal, specifically his theology of language. In contemporary Catholic theology, especially the great Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, on whom Peter is now completing or working on, working on a book on that, and also in Latino and Latino theology, with a special interest in Eucharistic theology. I'll read just a couple titles of some volumes that he's edited, just to give you a flavor. There's too many publications to speak of in detail. Christian Spirituality and the Culture of Modernity, 1998. Cuerpo de Cristo, the Hispanic Presence in the U.S. Catholic Church, 2003. A World for All, Global Civil Society in Political Theory and Trinitarian Theology, 2011. And he has some other studies of Nicholas of Cusa that he's working on, and as I said, the book on von Balthasar. Somehow Peter also finds time to be a father of 4, and of all faiths, a catechist, 5? And a catechist, you should hurry up and have your lecture. And a catechist for junior high school students in his parish in Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Peter Casarella.
Buenos dias. Thank you for coming. It's a delight to see you all here. Thank you, David, Father Heft, Gary, for those kind introductions. Very generous. On the 1 a.m. thing, I did wake up, tossing and turning, and made it through the homily, and then promptly fell back asleep. Fortunately, my kids weren't with me, so I didn't set a bad example. So I'd just like to share some thoughts about Latinos and the present tasks of intercultural theology. There are manifold ways in which Latinos and Latinas contribute to the theological, ecclesial, and social renewal of our world today. The Latino presence, our presence, is a blessing on the U.S. landscape. The fact of cultural diversity represented by and within the Latino community is one dimension of this gift. But even the fact of diversity can't be considered to be self-evident. The fact of diversity engenders and even demands interpretation, demands thought. Accordingly, I'm going to just put this down like this. Accordingly, mestizaje, cultural mixing, mulatez, the mixing of racial identities, and hybridity are just a few of the more important ways in which the intercultural and interracial reality experienced by Latinos and Latinas has become an exciting point of departure for critical theological reflection. Rather than repeat those relatively well-known but still controverted points, I would like to open up 3 new lines of reflection this afternoon. The first has to do with the notion of interdisciplinarity. and the ways in which Latino theology and Latino studies may or may not converge. The second treats a Christian mode of, I'll use the Greek term, martyria, witnessing, offering testimony, a form of testimony that heeds a call from that point in which beauty and justice cross their own borders. The third issue concerns the question of conscience in a secular age as it relates to Latino and Latina experience. Here I seek to lay out the foundations for a new approach to the question of social conscience. Each of these lines of reflection is meant to illustrate the immense creativity that still lies dormant within the Latino experience. The unforeseen inauguration early this morning of a Latino pope is a propitious moment to think interculturally about the spiritual, cultural, artistic, intellectual, and moral resources that are waiting to be tapped in our very midst. So, section 1, genuine interdisciplinarity. I've spent much of my academic career collaborating on a variety of interdisciplinary projects, and David just alluded to some dimensions of it, not just in Latino theology, but I also ran for 4 years a Center for Medieval and Byzantine Studies, and now I'm directing the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. Such collaboration takes hard work, but even more so, an imaginative capacity to figure out how to reconfigure the disciplines in the face of isolated silos of entrenchment. I faced this latter challenge in a rather acute manner on December 12, 2012. On this day, I sat down to write the guest editor preface to a journal. It's called Diálogo. And this was an issue of DePaul's Latino Studies Journal that I was preparing with my colleague in the Center for Latino Research. Her name is Elizabeth Martinez. I thought that taking time for this important task on a Latino feast day would give me inspiration. Instead, I realized that the end was near. Last year, the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe almost collided with the Mayan apocalypse. As you know, on December 12th, Guadalupanos throughout the globe, not just in the Americas, but also in the Philippines, where the devotion is so strong. On December 12th, Guadalupanos throughout the globe gather at daybreak to greet her with the singing of Las Mañanitas. I'm not going to sing it, but I'll just remind you of one aspect of the refrain. Despierta, madre, despierta, mire que ya amaneció, mire este ramo de flores que para ti traigo yo. Awake, mother, awake, behold what the dawn has brought. Behold the bouquet of flowers I am bringing you. La Morenita appeared to St. Juan Diego with flower and song, floricanto. The miraculous appearance of roses in December signified a radical new beginning for many of the indigenous. Flower and song is not an adornment. It represents for the Nahuatl the very concept of truth. Thus, the simple gesture of greeting the Virgin with flowers is a statement of a new mindset, a philosophical empowerment of a new mestizaje. The presence of flower and song confirm that the story of the appearance of La Morenita contains a well-timed and timely truth. Her arrival was an extraordinary and unanticipated truth, but one which could not have come any sooner for the poor and the marginalized. That same week, so this is last December, news outlets were abuzz with reactions to the newly discovered but hardly new prediction of an end. For the Guadalupanos, I think, the portend of a Mayan apocalypse 9 days after their feast is not the biggest news. The event from a hill in Tepeyac is the real here and now. La Morenita is Mexico. She's America. She is woman. She is the evangelizer par excellence and the herald of a new church for the marginalized. Her images continue to multiply over time. But the people mark their lives by the memory of her appearance to the unknowing indigenous St. Juan Diego. In Des Plaines, Illinois, a suburb north of Chicago, the celebration on that day is mammoth. Some reports put the annual gathering at 200,000. Some people even report that it's the largest religious event in the United States of America, La Morenita in Des Plaines, Illinois. Elaine A. Peña, in her marvelous book, Performing Piety, Making Sacred Space with the Virgin of Guadalupe, accompanied the devout in Des Plaines. Peña theorizes about the transnational devotion in terms of building, walking, and conquering. She writes, "These modes of inquiry illustrate how Guadalupan devotion is a pervasive force in North American history, how the devotee's labor is often spatially and temporally polyvalent, how Guadalupan shrines in central Mexico and the Chicago area are transnationally linked by doctrine, tradition, aesthetic physical replication, and early 20th century labor circuits," end of quote. So what seems to some as merely an isolated celebration of immigrants carries these connotations and more. The hopes of those without documents are hopes born of great struggle and persistence. Peña is not the first critic to describe the Virgin's presence among a people as a hidden cultural force. The journalist Henry Adams also did so in a celebrated essay that he penned a little over a century ago. Adams's The Dynamo and the Virgin was written at the cusp of a new century and rightly pronounced the recently concluded Great Exposition of 1900 in Paris as the advent of a new age of technological progress. At the event, Adams encountered a room filled with electrical generators, machines converting forces of nature into a man-made entity, electricity. Adams understood the dynamo as a symbol of infinity, a moral force, much as the early Christians felt the cross. This force, he maintained, would come to dominate the world, especially, he said, in cultures like the United States, which recently had displayed a new openness to it. For Adams, the force left behind in the Parisian exhibit was symbolized by the Virgin of Chartres. He was certain, and not a little bit perturbed, that her memory would be wholly eclipsed by the entry onto the world stage of a new Prometheus, the very dynamic he had also encountered in the Columbian exhibition in Chicago in 1893. The dynamo had conquered the spirit that raised Gothic cathedrals to such heights. Adams was supremely confident of the epical threshold that stood before him. He wrote, "An American virgin would never dare command. An American Venus would never dare exist." He was sure, Adams was sure, that the moral force of medieval Catholicism was being replaced by a new human-centered force field, that of technology. Adams's theory of dynamic forces in history lacks nuance, but his remarks from the very beginning of the last century are truly the perfect foil to the celebration that took place on December 12, 2012 in Des Plaines. The recent Guadalupan celebration took place on 12/12/12, 112 years after Adams' errant prophecy of the end of the cult of the Virgin. Adams was cosmopolitan. He himself visited Cuba and Mexico. But when he wrote The Virgin and the Dynamo, he did not realize that the Mexican Revolution was but 10 years in the future. The first significant wave of Mexican laborers to the south side of Chicago and the founding of Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish on 91st Street came only a decade after that. Today, undergraduates in my classes at DePaul write papers on the cultural reality of La Morenita, even as they pursue degrees on computing and digital media. The Virgin of Guadalupe and a host of new dynamos exist side by side in Chicago today. What force will dominate in the future? It's hard to say. On the same day, December 12th, 2012, the Green, I have to say now, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, celebrated the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Rome with the first ever papal tweet. In 2012 in Chicago, the Virgin and the Dynamo are remapped in an extraordinary new configuration. The devotion in Des Plaines is illustrative of the changes taking place in the vicinity of Chicago and in the whole country. The force of Latino Catholicism is difficult to measure since the experiences of the younger generations are quite different from the experiences of the first waves of immigrants. The devotion in Des Plaines is illustrative of the changes taking place throughout the world on many levels. Both the memories and the task of building a new community of flower and song remain with us. So this is by way of saying something about the challenge of interdisciplinarity. I learned from my collaboration with my colleague at DePaul that Latino studies and Latino theology have not always walked on the same path. The collaboration we undertook, and it was actually for 2 issues of this journal, Dialogo, not yet complete, brought together 2 centers of learning. Both entities are committed to interdisciplinary research, one that fosters greater solidarity and understanding between North America and Latin America, and one that fosters and promotes themes of immigration and transnationalism. But the truly exciting part of the collaboration was to engage the Latino reality in the U.S. from dual perspectives, that of theology and that of cultural studies or Latino studies. So this is just an example of a particular experience that I think shows the need to think, not just to have these projects like we did with the 2 issues of the journal, but to think about what it is to collaborate and what the dimensions of the reality is that you're exploring. Part 2. This is more directly on the question of Latino theology. The witness to the pied beauty of difference. One way in which religious and cultural forces come together is through the vision of beauty. What is beauty? Beauty here is understood as a theological category that brings aesthetics and drama into a single domain. It's certainly not the detached scrutiny of an art critic or of a professional museum goer. Pope Benedict XVI, in a 2009 address delivered to artists in the Sistine Chapel, remarked about the transformative quality of beauty. So here's, in the background, you can see the Sistine Chapel before it was the place for an election. This quote is particularly evocative. He said to the artists, "Indeed, an essential function of genuine beauty, as emphasized by Plato, is that it gives us a healthy shock. It draws us out of ourselves, wrenches us away from resignation and from being content with the humdrum. It even makes us suffer, piercing us like a dart. But in so doing, it reawakens us, opening afresh the eyes of our hearts and minds, giving us wings, carrying us aloft." End of quote. From a Latina perspective, Cecilia González-Andreu has explored this point in her book, A Bridge to Wonder, Art as a Gospel of Beauty. But another thinker who I want to focus on today, a mentor for myself and for Cecilia, is the late Cuban-American theologian, Alejandro Garcia Rivera, 1951 to 2010. Alejandro Garcia Rivera writes about beauty in precisely the same fashion. He terms it the experience of wounded innocence. Garcia Rivera starts neither from eternal beauty nor from the positive beauty of empirical communities. He wrote about holiness in the midst of things. He wrote about the little stories in which the poor proclaim the beauty and holiness of their patron saints. Little stories, and he meant that in a fairly technical sense. Little stories, he maintained, can be used as the building blocks for a Christian mosaic of lived realities. That's why I began with the little story about Des Plaines, the little story that has 200,000 people. These little stories include, and here, following the lead of Garcia Rivera, these little stories include the semiotics of culture that he discovered in the lives of many others, including Martín de Porres, La Morenita, and his own native devotion, Our Lady of Charity. Alejandro told many little stories in a highly compelling and an insightful and wise manner. Today I'd like to recall the story he tells, the little story he tells of Estefania. She was a 2-month-old child of a Puerto Rican couple. She died of AIDS in a shabby housing project. Alejandro was born in Cuba, but left the Catholic Church in the United States only to return later, and he eventually became a professor at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, now part of Santa Clara University. So it's a part of this little story to grasp that he narrates it as a Lutheran pastor who was called to perform a burial in a barren lot overrun with weeds. The father of Estefania was also buried in this lot. Pastor Alejandro recognized a pauper's grave and a seat of faith. The place of the burial was later to become St. Martín de Porres Lutheran Church in Allentown, Pennsylvania, an irony that was not lost in the local Lutheran bishop who was expecting a church to be named after a different Martin. Garcia Rivera unveils the power and depth of a single act of witnessing utilizing aesthetic categories. He writes about a material object, the statue of the saint in the New Lutheran Church. This is a longish quote, but I'm going to read it because it brings together some very important ideas. Kalokagatia is a Greek word for which we have no modern counterpart. It is a word that grasps an intrinsic connection between the good agathos and the beautiful kalos. I see that mark in that statue of Saint Martin de Porres. As such, kalokagatia, as represented by the simple statue, calls into question what the world has come to know as either beautiful or holy. It also recovers one of the lost marks of the church. Did Mary Magdalene, for example, become holy in spite of her sins or because of her sins? Indeed, the Magdalene's holiness is measured less by her moral purity than by her ability to become innocent again. And such innocence is beautiful. It is beautiful because it is a work of art, God's art. God fashions the Magdalene soul out of her former sins into a new innocence that is beautiful. If I were to translate the word kalokagatia, it would be wounded innocence. The church has marks. I saw this as I stood in front of the unmarked gravesite of little Estefania. I sensed then that God would not leave that place unmarked. In the ecumenical miracle of a San Martin de Porres Lutheran church, I saw that a very special mark of the church transcends the sins of the human church. It is the innocence of those who stand at an unmarked gravesite yet hope for things unseen. Such hopes then become marks, marks that have filled the church with music, color, tapestries, statues, paintings, dance, drama, and 1,000 other forms since its beginning. End of quote. What kind of aesthetics do we have here? To paraphrase Roberto Goizueta, Garcia Rivera moves towards a liberating theological aesthetics by recognizing that, like Thomas the Apostle, the one who perceives beauty does so in the recognition of the absence of God. The agonizing experience of God's absence and the pain and suffering of the marginalized is a form of presence. Garcia Rivera shows the coincidence of two truths that have diverged in our contemporary discourse and experience. One, the beauty and goodness and the wounded innocence of the poor of Jesus Christ. And two, a theology of cultural difference rooted in a semiotic understanding of faith and culture. For Garcia Rivera, beauty and goodness are neither descending nor ascending. Those transcendentals of being come to light as refracted through difference in both nature and culture. What kind of theory of aesthetic perception does Garcia Rivera defend? His fullest statement is found in The Community of the Beautiful, a Theological Aesthetics. The book begins with a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins entitled Pied Beauty. This poem is transformed into a theory of praise for the cosmic and social community of signs. Garcia Rivera embraces the anagogical difference between creator and creature. Through the U.S. philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce and the Franciscan theologian John Duns Scotus, and it's interesting how he brings those two together, he embraces the formal distinction as a lens for grasping the semiotic community of difference in created reality as a good in itself. His theology of cultural difference builds on his semiotically construed ontological realism. The key insight in the community of the beautiful concerns the continuity between the experience of St. Juan Diego and the call of the Latin American Bishops' Conference at Medellin in 1968 for a preferential option for the poor. Popular Catholicism, theological aesthetics, and solidarity with the poor all stem from one vision of faith, grounded in the concrete perception of beauty and goodness. An aesthetic imagination makes judgments about reality based upon the perception of beauty and goodness. Drawing upon the Magnificat of Mary, as well as the liturgical canticle of the three youth in the furnace, Garcia Rivera suggests that an enculturated, quote, lifting up of the lowly, unquote, will establish an aesthetic mode of interpretation that is not only doxological, but also redemptive and liberating. The new aesthetics will give birth to a new community. He writes, redemption, in light of God's ordaining power, is less a state of mere existence or an invisible inner reality than an ordained existence, a common reality in the midst of marvelous differences, a community where the invisible becomes visible by the power of a bold and daring spiritual imagination that makes manifest communities of truth, goodness, and above all, the beautiful. End of quote. The greatness and the vulnerability of this vision lie in the power of the Latino creative imagination to give expression to the thisness, the term of Scotus. In Spanish, I would do it a little differently. I would say the actualidad of beauty in our very midst. If there is a myopia in Garcia Rivera's generous vision of cosmic liturgy, it lies in a certain overconfidence regarding the faculty of the imagination as such. He rightly recognizes that the poor are indeed invested with a powerful imagination through their indigenous and unmodern traditions of popular Catholicism. But Garcia Rivera's artistic model of redemption still suffers from a touch of romanticism. The late Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, passed away on May 13th, 2012, counterbalances this idealizing tendency with her theology of lo cotidiano, the everyday. Her mujerista account of justice is refreshingly concrete, without losing sight of the big picture. She argues on the basis of her engagement with, and on behalf of, Latinas seeking justice, that they have understood the central Christian text not in elaborated discourse, but rather in thoughtful implementation. The difference between the theory of justice of these two Cuban-American theologians is subtle but important. Garcia Rivera holds firm to a vision of beauty and justice rooted in cultural difference. Isasi Diaz sees the convergence of love and justice in the slow and patient process of social engagement at the level of the grassroots. She's highlighting the need for complementing cosmogonic theories of justice with practical wisdom about implementation. She says, a mujerista account of justice has to announce our proyecto histórico in a precise enough way so as to make choosing necessary, so as to force an option against injustice and for justice. So the problem with Garcia Rivera's cosmic liturgy of justice is that the solution seems to be present everywhere you look. Isasi Diaz sat with women who inherited practical wisdom and popular devotions from their mothers and grandmothers. What they offered in their simple stories, their accounts of how to arrive at un poquito de justicia, is the whole truth of the community's beauty. Part 3. Social conscience in a secular age, some Latino perspectives. In his very first papal homily, even prior to the inauguration, His Holiness Francis I said, and I quote, without faith in Christ's sacrifice on the cross, the Church is nothing more than a pitiful NGO. End of quote. Something very much like this thought has often crossed my mind while participating in Latino popular Catholicism. This is fellow Washingtonians. This is in Adams Morgan neighborhood, the Peruvian devotion of Our Lady of Miracles, going through that neighborhood. It's Lent in October. The event of the cross is usually at the very center of many popular devotions, but the witness for justice and reconciliation is never far behind. The issue here is hardly academic. Alan Figueroa Deck, Ken Davis Mondragon, Tim Matavina, Josman Ospino, and many, many others have documented the dramatic intergenerational changes that are taking place in Latino Catholicism and Latino Christianity. I sense it in the classroom. Latino youth are Mexican and Catholic during the summer when they visit Mexico and are surrounded by generations of like-minded believers and a global cultural heritage, and are Americanist, careerists, and consumerists when they return to Chicago for the beginning of the new academic year. My Mexican-American students need a new synthesis that begins with their own yearning to connect the faith of the people, with a sense of community, and to connect that with social action. Recent Catholic theology, let me just see, something more at home. I think that the photographer who took this picture told me he took it where the Staples Center is now, in that neighborhood. But I didn't know much about Los Angeles. Yeah, okay. Plus ça change. Recent Catholic theology has stressed that Christ's preferential option for the poor is the watermark of authentic Catholic communion. Christ calls us to be disciples who preach the good news of social justice and peace. We cannot achieve this discipleship by attending only to the concerns of the individual. In the words of Benedict XVI, pronounced in 2007 before the bishops of Latin America and Aparecida in Brazil, quote, "Love of God and love of neighbor have become one. In the least of the brethren we find Jesus himself, and in Jesus we find God. The Christian life is not expressed solely in personal virtues, but also in social and political virtues." So that's a very important statement made before the Latin American bishops, but made in the midst of all these controversies that have been going on since the mid-'80s about the relationship between the magisterium and Latin American liberation theology. A very clear statement about the need not just to have an individualistic ethic of personal virtue, but these social and political virtues. If we recognize that we suffer together in the body of Christ, then we will also labor as part of our Christian discipleship to eradicate structures that perpetuate poverty and foment social strife. Interpersonal communication and intercultural dialogue are essential in a diverse church. Effective and faithful witnesses to social reconciliation are desperately needed in our privatizing and even our secular culture. The encounter with the person of Christ brings about a unique and always renewable change of heart. By allowing ourselves to encounter afresh the face of the risen Lord, we make the church into a home and a school of communion. Encountering Christ can dissolve hard-heartedness slowly, including the sins of racism and ethnocentrism. This encounter makes possible a new culture of hospitality. Welcoming the stranger, here's a Santero artist on this theme, welcoming the stranger gets to the heart of what the Nazarene preached and taught in Galilee. The gift of a hospitable Catholic Church, precisely in view of its introverted polarizations, abiding fragility, and scandalous shortcomings, remains our strength as a Christian community and as witnesses to a new reality in history. But some new ideas are needed as well. The idea of a North-South communion proposed by Pope John Paul II in his post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Ecclesia in America, needs to be revisited with fresh new perspectives. To that end, I would like to propose a reading of Leopoldo Thea's 1953 classic, America como Conciencia. To be sure, there are shortcomings here as well. Leopoldo Zea was a Mexican philosopher. He taught at UNAM, who initially worked on positivism in Mexican thought. So he was very oriented towards modern developments in Latin American philosophy. And then he began to write about the perspectivalism of Ortega y Gasset. He wanted to extend the legacy of Bolivar and Vasconcelos to forge an idiom that was genuinely philosophical and that would somehow bridge the divide between North and South. The current philosopher of liberation at UNAM, Enrique Dussel, has rightly criticized all of this generation for their failure to develop an ethics of liberation of the poor. At the same time, the language of conciencia in Zea's work is truly fascinating, and it's worth our attention this afternoon. The Spanish word can be translated into English as either, and this would be true of the Latin too, but it's certainly true of the Spanish, as either awareness or conscience. So conciencia is a broader category than conscience. If the latter signifies the primary abode of a universalizable moral imperative, Kant, then the former is also a mode of consciousness and reflection that struggles with personal and cultural memory. So this whole other anamnetic dimension to conciencia that I don't immediately see in the word conscience. Here I can treat only two elements of Zea's theory, what he called the dialectical movement of conciencia, and then the idea of la superposición de las culturas. Zea's dialectical view of progress is thoroughly modern, but not like that of Hegel. Like Hegel, he recognizes that the struggle of opposing forces is what moves history. Unlike Hegel, he sees no resolution of the struggle into a higher conceptual synthesis, the so-called Anstrengung des Begriffs. The fight over unresolved contradictions is full of paradoxes, and the playing out of that struggle has been simply brutal in the history of the Americas. Rather than sublation, Zea sees conquista, regateo, conquest, haggling as the forces that move history. The treatment of the other as other, a point that later was taken up by Dussel, is going to be the source of the violence if there is no authentic witness to the true nature of historical processes. Zea saw American culture, so not U.S. culture, but the possible forging of a new American culture that bound together North and South. Zea saw American culture as offering the spectacle of a patent and external desgarramiento, pain, anguish, tearing apart. Different layers of culture had been superimposed on top of one another, starting with the colonial conquest of the indigenous cultures. Unlike European culture, which has the pretense of being a unified culture, the process of superposición does not allow for integration. In fact, Zea defines this process as radically opposed to assimilation. Let me read it first in Spanish, and then I'll try to render it into English. Superponer es poner sin alteración una cosa sobre otra, aunque estas sean distintas y contradictorias, o una cosa al lado de la otra. En cambio, asimilar es igualar, hacer de cosas distintas una sola. La superposición mantiene los conflictos propios de la diversamente superpuesto. La asimilación los elimina. So to superimpose is to put something into place without altering it, one thing on top of another, although they're really distinct and contradictory, one thing by the side of another. On the other hand, to assimilate is to level out the differences, to make things that are really distinct into one single thing. Superimposition maintains or safeguards the conflicts that are endemic to something that has been superimposed in a diverse fashion. Assimilation eliminates all of those conflicts. The difficulty here is that there's no easy synthesis, since the layers of faith and culture are simply placed on top of one another. This can lead to a personality disorder in the mind of the person who fails to recognize the burden of multiple layers. It certainly leads to a great deal of confusion by Anglos about the problem of Latino identity. Are they Mexican? Are they American? What are they? The point here is that conciencia is a difficult process that all residents of America need to undergo. This is what Alex Garcia Rivera meant by wounded innocence. Zea's moves here are only a first step. Dussel is probably correct that a fully developed philosophy of liberation cannot begin just with the dialectical movement of conscience, removed from the economic determinants of historical and material forces of production. Moreover, Thea counterbalances Latin American romanticism by integrating positivist insights into his vision, but in the end, his grasp of the struggle between matter and spirit is not the basis for an integral philosophy or theology of the human person. Leopoldo Zea is nonetheless the proponent of a thoughtful starting point for facing the contemporary challenge of how faith, social progress, and cultural memory need to be brought together into a new synthesis for the sake of Latino youth and for the sake of the wider culture. So, since we got on to the topic of the Pope, I've added a little postscript here. This will just take 1 minute, about whether the election of a Latino Pope makes a difference in terms of intercultural theology. The European blood of Pope Francis I and his ability to converse fairly easily in Italian with the people of God in Rome made the transition to a Latino Pope a little bit less painful, let's say, to the College of Cardinals. But the particular manner in which Pope Francis has begun his papacy merits some attention in light of what we just discussed. He embodies more than one coincidence of opposites, so I got in my Nicholas of Cusa reference there. The first pope from the Americas is proud to bond with Paesi, whence come his Italian forebears to the Americas. A conservative by Jesuit standards, he cautioned his confreres as provincial against radicalism during the travesty of the Argentine Dirty War. He now adopts the name of the radical saint whom Ignatius of Loyola himself emulated. He's famous for his personal humility and charitable acts on behalf of the poor and marginalized. But his program for social reform has not yet been unveiled, although in the homily, which I stayed up for, he made some very interesting remarks about protection of the environment. I discovered some possible clues to Pope Francis' views on faith and conscience in an interview he gave in the fall of 2007, and I wanted to share those with you. At the time, this is fall of 2007, he came to Rome for a consistory of new cardinals. Instead of gathering with Pope Benedict and the other cardinals in meetings, he was sidelined due to illness and forced, quite against his will, to spend more time than planned away from his beloved Buenos Aires. He told the interviewer, "Buenos Aires es mi esposa," my wife. Have to return to my wife. Now he's really stuck. Rather than making any public appearances, he spoke to this lone reporter about the role he had played in that same year, in 2007, as the chair of the drafting committee for the concluding document from Pope Benedict's visit to Aparecida, which I referenced a minute ago. As such, his words from 2007 are revealing, for they might tell us something about his program for Latin America, maybe something about his ideas for the church. The then Cardinal Bergoglio said that there were three pillars to the final statement from Aparecida. First, from below upwards. Second, liturgy and popular piety as a unifying and evangelizing force. And third, the fact that fidelity to the Lord is a blossoming, a growth. So let me review these 3 points individually. From below upwards. The first point had to do with the collegiality of the national bishops' conferences in Latin America in the preparation of the final declaration from Aparecida. The committee he chaired reviewed 2,240, in Latin they call them modi, suggestions for the final document, and was tasked with creating a harmonious whole out of all of these interventions. So in the interview, he evoked a patristic testimony that he's also cited in recent days, literally. He said, this is from 2007, one of the early fathers of the church, I think he's referring to Augustine, but that's still an open question. He said, one of the early fathers of the church wrote that the Holy Spirit is the very harmony that is sought. Ipsa harmonia es. This is the harmony that we seek in the church, that of the Holy Spirit. Cardinal Bergoglio continued. He said, at Aparecida we collaborated in this work of the Holy Spirit. In the document, if one reads it well, one sees that it has the circular, harmonic thinking that we wanted. The harmony is perceived not as passive but creative, that urges creativity because it is of the Spirit. End of quote. So our new Pope has a profound and profoundly Latino vision of ecclesial harmony and the collegiality of the national bishops' conferences. Now, John Allen and many others have reported, I read an interview with the Viennese Cardinal Schönborn on this, that this idea of collegiality fits with one of the top items discussed in the general congregation. It was kind of the recipe that many of the electors were looking for. That's interesting, I think. The second pillar points to a beautiful set of passages in the Aparecida document, ones that the then Cardinal Bergoglio compares to the encyclical Evangelii Nuntiandi of Paul VI. Here's the passage to which he points. They're passages about popular Catholicism. I'll cite it from the document of Aparecida. Popular spirituality is a legitimate way of living the faith, a way of feeling part of the church, and a manner of being missionaries where the deepest vibrations of America's depth come together. It is part of a cultural historic originality of the poor of this continent, and fruit of a synthesis between their cultures and the Christian faith. In the environment of secularization experienced by our peoples, it is still a powerful confession of the living God who acts in history, and a channel for handing on the faith. Journeying together to shrines and taking part in other manifestations of popular piety, also taking one's children or inviting others, is in itself an evangelizing gesture by which the Christian people evangelizes itself and fulfills the church's missionary calling. That's from Aparecida, final document number 264. Accordingly, both Eucharist and popular religiosidad popular, popular Catholicism, are essential for bringing the people of God together as a community, to bringing them together as a community that belongs together, and to bringing them together as a missionary community, one task with professing faith in Christ. Bergoglio's third pillar is the most interesting and has also appeared in nearly verbatim form in statements from the first days of his new pontificate. He says, this is from 2007, remaining faithful, one goes out. Fidelity is always a change, a blossoming, a growth. And there's a quote from Vincent of Lorraine there that's interesting that I'm not going to go into here. The then Cardinal Bergoglio has a strong Ignatian sense, and here I quote him one more time, that the Holy Spirit lets us enter the mystery of God and saves us from the danger of a Gnostic and from the danger of a self-referential church leading us to the mission. End of quote. He compares the complacent priests and lay people who are too focused on the creation of their own well-tested pastoral plans to Jonah running away from a difficult mission and going to Tarsus rather than Nineveh. He concludes by saying that the greatest danger for the church in the present age is what Henri de Lubac calls spiritual worldliness. There's another quote that John Allen cited, and therefore meant that everyone had to repeat, about the priest who came to him in Buenos Aires, saying, should we baptize the children of unwed mothers? And he said, not only should you do it, but the very fact that you're asking me this is a sign of hypocritical neo-clericalism. That must sting to get that from your provincial. I mean, it's very interesting, his perspective on these things. So, just by way of conclusion, a church built upon collegiality that listens to the cry of the poor, a church that attends to the beauty of popular religion on the streets, a church that enters into the secular ennui of all ages with apostolic fervor. All of these traits would help to implement a Latino reform of Catholicism. They are plainly visible in the Latino community in the U.S., but are proffered here simply as universal and Catholic principles of reform. I can't wait to see what happens next. Thank you for your attention.
We'll have Peter stay up here. I'm going to be with the walk-around mic, so if you want your comment on the record, just stick your hand up and I'll run to you.
If you want it off the record, you know what to do as well. Cecilia.
Thanks, Peter. Well, I'm going to start with where you ended and kind of relate a little bit to my experience I just had at the meeting of the Association of Theological Schools in Pittsburgh. And so 60% evangelical theologians, 30% mainline Protestant theologians, 10% Catholics, because that's the makeup of the Association of Theological Schools. And the name of Francis was brought up repeatedly. And in the keynote address, the Methodist church historian referred to Francis actually being all our Pope, to this gathering of theologians from North America. And there was something, and one of my colleagues at LMU, as I was telling them about this, said, people do seem to be smitten. And I'm just wondering about this relationship of beauty as felt, right? And how we're seeing, what we're seeing as a reception and a reaction to Francis in the Christian community.
No, it's a very good comment. I don't have too much to add. I mean, I added that just because it's timely and because it's not just an intra-Catholic event. I mean, the Patriarch of Constantinople was present for the first time in Catholic history. But I guess maybe I can report just some of, looking at blogs and reading some of the things going on in Buenos Aires. Conservative negative reaction to Pope Francis from liturgical traditionalists. They said, oh, he's not even a polyglot, and the things they cited as evidence against the Holy Spirit being work at this conclave was that when he met with Protestants in Buenos Aires, he did what he did on the balcony of the Vatican. He bowed his head and asked for their blessing. So this was a sure sign that something was amiss for these particular observers. The first day of his papacy, he invited the chief rabbi of Rome, and he came to the inauguration, from what I gather. So, I mean, I'm not here to prognosticate. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen or how this pontificate is going to go, but it just seemed a Latino pope is something that we should all reflect on. And I'm very hopeful that it will be a great ecumenical event, so we have to see.
Another element of this recent election and all that, from one point of view, it wouldn't have made any difference who was chosen as Pope. What is intriguing is all the world media attending this event. And if nothing else, I just see this as a wonderful opportunity to continue to proclaim the message, which is, what the church is about. And what's beautiful is I think Francis really hits the nail on the head in that regard. But it's fascinating that for all its secularity, the media had nothing else to do but to try to find any story it can regarding this process.
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment too. I mean, I did a lot of media work, more than I'd done in my whole life. I mean, I'm a celebrity in 600-year cycles with papal resignations. I mean, I try to treat it as an educational engagement because, I mean, you can get up there and say what you just read in John Allen and just repeat the same things. But I try to take things because he came out of the gate. He drove the Vatican crazy. He didn't stick to his script. He was speaking extemporaneously. They hate that. And so I tried to add, try to deepen some of these thoughts that he gave and put that into the sound bites. And sometimes people like that, sometimes they didn't. I mean, I think one of the other people here can speak to this, but one of the preconceptions people have is that in Latin America and Latino community, faith is very coherent, and it's just in the North, in Europe and North America, where this fragmentation is taking place. That's not what the sociological literature is showing. It's obviously distinct, but I mean, the latest polls in Brazil shows that there's a rapid rise in the number of people who are saying non-believer among university students in Sao Paulo, for example. In Argentina, I've gone there 3 times to Buenos Aires for different reasons, academic reasons, and my impression is that the church is coherent and unified. That's certainly not his experience with the 2 regimes, President Kirchner and her predecessor, her husband. But I don't mean it as a political statement. I think that he's had to, Pope Francis has had to deal with secularism in Latin America. And so his challenge, that's why this interview was interesting, because he's speaking also to the challenge of secularism and not just to drawing upon some pre-existent reality, some fixed thing, Latino or Latin American Catholicism. So I dug up a writing of his that a friend had sent me. It's a meditation. He did a book presentation on a book called The Religious Sense by he's very friendly towards an ecclesial movement, communion liberation. And so he wrote this meditation on this book called The Religious Sense. And he was talking about something there, this is from a few years ago, but then Cardinal Bergoglio was talking about something that he also talked about in his first homilies, that as Christians we're called to walk out into the world, this sense of mission and this metaphor of walking. He used Italian, camminare, but Goizueta's famous book, Caminemos con Jesus, uses exactly the same metaphor, that our faith journey, our discipleship is walking into the, Goizueta talked about San Fernando Cathedral. You have a beautiful cathedral hill in LA. You walk into the church, you walk out of the church. Your whole Christian life is about walking. But then he did something I didn't see coming in this writing. He talked about agnostics and people who are seeking and people who are walking and not sure where they're going, and the need for the church to look at that carefully. And he said that he has benefited greatly from agnostic poets. He mentioned Orazio Armani, a famous poet in Buenos Aires, who he says opens up many different questions about life, all of which had to be attended to by Christian educators, by people thinking about the life of faith. So that to me, I mean, we're just looking for signs here, because the guy's only had a couple days to be pope, and signs for the wider world. But I mean, that to me showed that the question of the seekers, or Christian Smith calls it moralistic therapeutic deism, whatever you want to call it, the question of people who are at sea and not necessarily very stable in their faith, young or old, that's a question that he's ready to address, and he's thought about it in terms of other people in the world, Catholic, Christian, non-Catholic, non-Christian, who've had similar posing of questions. So that's encouraging.
Thank you, Peter, for your comments. A couple of years ago, Benedict made a fascinating statement about agnostics. I believe it was when he was in Germany. And he thanked them as honest searchers that really challenged believers to find ways that are persuasive to speak about their faith. I've wondered to myself, there are many things in the writings of Benedict that I've been very impressed with, very profound. Some of the speeches he made in Germany as well as in England. I'll always thank him for beatifying Newman. But I wonder whether there might be some rhythm here where some of these profound insights of Benedict, who was more limited in embodying them personally, might now be able to be brought forward in a more direct, communicative way with this particular Pope. Again, as you said several times, we're only in the very early stages, and who knows. But it does occur to me there might be a way here that someone who brought an unusual degree of precise articulation theologically to the papacy, from the papacy, I should say, might now be looking for a way, the Church, to capitalize on that. I'm not going to say he's just going to work off of Benedict, but I think there's a beautiful groundwork that's been laid in several pieces that Benedict wrote.
Well, that's a good comment. Let me just try to very quickly respond to it. I was very inspired by Benedict's theological writings. And I'll just cite one. It's not a theological writing. It's a speech he gave in the Bundestag, where, of all places in the Bundestag, to bring up natural law and to bring it up and say that it's an opening to, and the Green Party is there to talk about the environment. That caught me by surprise. So this theme in Benedict that our concepts of reason have been fragmented, have been narrowed by technical manipulation, by compartmentalization, and need to broaden the concept of reason itself. That's a persistent theme. It goes back to his Habilitationsschrift on Bonaventure, when he first, to my knowledge, wrote about how revelation opens up the domain of reason. From the little reading I've done, Cardinal Bergoglio, now Pope Francis I, is a very learned man. He's Argentine, so they're always full of surprises. And he's a poet, but he can then utilize those resources. I mean, just, we were talking before, the cross, he didn't take the official papal cross, pectoral cross, and has a simple white cross that he brought from Argentina. His favorite painting is Chagall's White Crucifixion, which is in the Art Institute of Chicago. His cross is not like that, although some Italian journalists have made that claim. But the cross has Christ, the Good Shepherd, on the cross. So we see some evidence that he's going to be a more pastoral Bishop of Rome. We'll have to see where that goes.
Thanks. Going back to your lecture, there are several themes that I heard that all of which have very strong political implications. You talked about justice, you talked about culture and intercultural, the idea of mestizaje and the idea of superimposición versus assimilation, all of which are very relevant to the Latino community at this stage. But my comment and then question is, whenever we're talking about justice, we are really talking about a political hot button. And I'm particularly referencing an image that I saw from Chavez in Venezuela. And, you know, he has kind of taken the idea of justice and morphed it into a political thing that he uses to his advantage. And he even had this painting of the Last Supper with Jesus in the middle and Bolivar to his right. And, you know, and the whole idea that he now represents the poor Chavez and Chavismo, and that he now is speaking for justice. So my question then is, as we, as committed Christians, have a mandate to seek justice and to procure justice in our communities, how do we avoid the notion of getting into a situation where we simply come up with political to do things so that they can be used by and manipulated by the political system, so that whoever represents this type of things that we're interested in is not going to get our vote. And I'm just concerned that we need to constantly evolve our idea of justice from a Christian perspective, so that we are not caricatured into a soundbite that is going to capture our vote, or that is going to equate our Christian mandate with a political stance.
No, excellent question. I was faced by reporters in the last days and weeks, not putting it this way, but basically saying, is Pope Francis Democrat or Republican? I mean, wanting to know where, it wasn't adding up, in other words, by U.S. standards. And, that was a good question, but, I mean, it's just, we can be very narrow. So on Chavez, I'm not an expert on Venezuela, but I have a colleague, Rafael Luciani, is a professor at the Greg and at the Andres Bello University, and he's been sending me his blogs. He sent me a blog about 2 hours before the announcement of Chavez's death on Chavez's messianism. And a critical Christian, he's writing a Christology now, but I mean, a critical Christian engagement with the problem that they're facing in Venezuela. He's writing as a Venezuelan of the apotheosis of Chavez that was taking place in the very midst. So the other thing that I can report, talking to him and another colleague who taught at that same university some years ago, is that the university professors are not with Chavez, and that the freedom of education, the freedom of speech there on that level was not being respected. So those two things, I mean, patent and hyperbolic messianism combined with lack of freedom of speech, as an outsider, not claiming to be an expert on the situation, already signals that there's serious issues to be looked at there. I can maybe relate a little bit also about the parallel track, and that is a visit I made 2 summers ago to Havana, mainly to work with the Archdiocese, but also one visit to the Seminario Evangelico. But I was there after the papal visit, and of course the papal visit was meant to coincide with the celebration, the big anniversary of Our Lady of Charity. Talking to mainly people on the Catholic side, but there were at least 5, maybe 7 million people that processed with the Virgin through the island during that anniversary, just prior to the Pope's visit. I mean, some Protestants, rightly, following their conscience, didn't want to participate in a Marian devotion. I understand that. That's very respectable. But you can't say that those 5 million people are all church-going Catholics either. I mean, this was a cultural phenomenon. Was it like in Solidarność, like in Poland in the 80s, in-your-face thing to the regime? No, that's not what people... I mean, I talked to people in the pastoral office of Archdiocese of Havana to get some kind of read on this. No, it wasn't against the regime, but it was a sign of, I don't know, having studied medieval church history, libertas ecclesiae. I mean, the church needed to express its own form of freedom, and following the Virgin of Charity through the island for that one moment when the church attendance is at 5%, to see half or 2/3 of the whole island mobilized in that way it was a wake-up moment for the people I talked to. It was a form of liberation, and then they returned to their own fragile existence, not sure where the relationship between the churches and the regime was going to go afterwards. I mean, it wasn't as if everything had been broken down. So that's a sign to me that even on an ecumenical level, that the people of God, when they're moved by faith and respond independently, not by voting and not by what is normally taken to be politics, commenting on the regime, can change a culture, can change a mentality, can make room for something. I mean, that's why, even though Alejandro Garcia Rivera is my hero, I did want to compliment what he said about beauty with Ada Maria Esacerias, because she worked from the grassroots, and she was very bold and in your face and just as Cuban. And but she said it's un poquito de justicia es lo que buscamos, because you have to approach it step by step. And so there's a brilliant wisdom there that maybe the Our Lady of Charity processions in Cuba was just the first step, and then everyone retreated back to the old ways. But at least they saw that there's a kind of vision of what's coming. So that's not electoral politics in the U.S. That's not even Latin American politics. But that is a new way of thinking about reality that includes political reality, I think. Please.
Thank you. I have a couple of comments. I'm coming to this not from the standpoint of theology. I'm coming at this from the standpoint of a critical theorist, anchored in the work of Paulo Freire, who we cannot deny has a certain Ignatian quality to many of the ideas that he espouses. And actually, you could make a correlation very, very easily. But I think it was easier to sell it in a more secular world in the way that he addressed it. But there's a couple of issues that I was thinking about this question of assimilation because, see, I think I struggle with this notion of assimilation, particularly as a person of color, somebody who grew up in poverty, who lived in poverty until I was 30 years old, somebody who's had a very different life than the majority of my colleagues, who has had to move through, in the flesh, the ways in which power operate and the manner in which often there's a talking about politics that somehow doesn't get down to the nitty-gritty of structures that reproduce inequalities and reproduce injustice. And so the issue of justice goes, to me, within the church, are part of the issues that we have to come forth. And we can't ever pretend that there aren't ideologies at work, that there aren't cultural values that are very much anchored in the way that human beings survive. And there's this element of always moving towards homogenizing life that really I see extremely problematic in a politics of assimilation. And that what it does is it pretends that people survive the same. And the one thing that many of us know very, very well is that surviving in one condition where one is barely scraping to be able to put food on your children's table and be able to get them through the day is very, very different than people who grow up quite affluent and are able to kind of, move slowly. I mean, you're more tolerant of moving slowly when your life is comfortable. And I can say that from the standpoint of having to be very, very self-vigilant in my own life in relationship to being more comfortable now and still maintaining a politics of urgency because of so many folks in our communities who, in fact, really need urgent movement. And so I think there's that dialectic always at work between the urgency that's necessary and the elements that we're trying to conserve that are also at work, particularly within the church. So, I mean, that's one piece. The other thing that most important for me is this issue of beauty. And I think what I want to say is I think that there's incredible possibility in the ability to resurrect this notion of beauty within the context of our work. And the reason I say this is I believe we're living in a world, it's not just in Latin America, I mean, this is now an international phenomenon, with a culture industry, where advertising, it has hijacked the meaning of beauty, the essence of beauty. I mean, it has hijacked it, and our young people are exposed to that. We're all exposed to that to one extent or another. And it seems to me that this is a really critical moment in the history of the church, in the history of Christianity, in the history of all that that seeks a better world, in terms of how do we engage this question of beauty and reinscribe it with respect to what it might mean in the evolution of the church and the evolution of our humanity within the context of our work.
Well, thank you for that testimony. It's very eloquent. I don't have too much to add. Maybe just one comment about beauty and commodification, which is obviously a huge topic. But I don't know if you know the critic. She's culturally a Catholic, although only in that level, Camille Paglia. And the kind of comments that she's made about how art in our world today is religion, and the attempt to kind of smash the idol of this deified art industry and get to a more, I don't know, Gramscian or a more counter-hegemonic understanding of where beauty can enter in. I feel that the Latino theologians, they're not following, marching to that drumbeat, but they are making a contribution and kind of presenting a new perspective on beauty.
Peter, I kind of going back to your un poquito de justicia, kind of occurred to me that reading Boff, who seems to be very excited about the new Pope, Leonardo Boff, is, even suggesting that probably this could become the Pope de toda la cristiandad, which is kind of an interesting way. And perhaps all these, kind of trying to put this one with the other, perhaps what Christianity both, or, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, the Orthodox, and all those who doesn't put any name on it, might want a little, un poquito de unidad, un poquito de transparencia, un poquito de ownership, popular ownership. And I wonder, is in your estimation, I'm not a Catholic theologian yet. A great part of me is Catholics. I mean, I don't think myself, I don't think homogeneously being a Baptist or a Protestant theologian, systematician. I think I'm very much, in the very sense of the word, a hybrid in many ways. But do you see in this time a little more, possibility of building a discourse, both theoretically and practically, in terms of a more ecumenical, conversation, trying to go beyond this left and right, bifurcation of fundamentalist, liberalist, divide that seems to go over the whole world. We go out of the United States and we start and put the stamp that as we are, everybody is. So we have always right and left everywhere else, and sometimes that's not the case in the non-West. But do you see a movement forward? I'm very interested about la conciencia de América as an idea of, and I'm really searching for kind of a, if I may, a continental, global Latino conscience, if I may, something that is very aware of the not in an assimilationist way, but a kind of a more complex, hybrid, interconnected way. But do you see a movement forward toward that within, the Roman Catholic tradition, and perhaps even beyond that, because you've been involved perhaps in some conversations?
No, that's brilliant. No hay iglesia en América sin un poquito de unidad. We can just put it like that. So John Paul II had this idea that there's one church on the American hemisphere continent, going from all the way up Canada down to Tierra del Fuego, but that's very romantic, and it fits into this romantic tradition that I alluded to. Vasconcelos, very problematic, but had the same idea. Zea, a little bit more realistic, but there's some problems there too. The experience of Latinos in the United States is not always that of conscience or consciousness of America. I taught for 14 years at the Catholic University of America, and every once in a while when I wanted to be a bad boy, I'd ask administrators, so what is this America that we keep citing in our title? And they would look at me like, why do you say, what's the problem? It's obviously the United States. No, but so your point is a really profound one, and it's a very challenging one, that in terms of Christian unity, in terms of interreligious dialogue, but in terms of what ecclesia means from north to south, the Latinos have a critical role because we're bridge builders. We're on the border, and by that I mean Pilsen neighborhood in Chicago. I don't mean border south of here. I mean, the borders that exist all over the country. And so I like very much your suggestion of un poquito de unidad, because you know, I participated for 5 years on this bilateral Baptist World Alliance Roman Catholic Dialogue. We some very good work there with Timothy George and others. Nora Lozano I mentioned, and now it's stalled in the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. They had some comma or something they didn't like. I'm hoping that Francis is, with the encouragement from Father Boff, this kind of evangelical enthusiasm will get that thing out of there, and we'll have the document finally that we worked on so hard on Baptist Catholic unity. But I mean, I meant it in a very serious way, because a kind of vision of awareness for Christians in particular, but a vision of awareness of this single reality, we have to look at the real problems. And both of the international dialogues I participated in, the Baptist one, now I'm on the Catholic Reform Dialogue. It's meeting in South Bend in 2 weeks. Also a 5-year international project. But in both of them, it's clear that Latin America, which is between 40 and 42% of the international Roman Catholic Church, is the nodal point. I mean, they didn't pick a guy from Buenos Aires, or as he said, da lontano, from the ends of the earth, just by accident, although it kind of seemed that way. But they know, this College of Cardinals, that Latin America, I mean, to deal with problems in Europe, deal with problems in Africa and Asia, they have to be dealt with separately. But the Latin America is a really critical point for Christianity. I mean, the mutual castigation, the mutual prejudices, Catholics referring to Baptists and Pentecostals as mere sects, the problems about the Marian shrines. I mean, for me, as a theologian, I say, well, what is the actual devotion in Aparecida? In Argentina, it would be Luján. Obviously, in Mexico, La Villa. What is the relationship between that faith on the ground and Mary of the New Testament? That's, as a Catholic theologian, a question I want to put on the table and discuss among Catholics, and then bring it out so that we can offer un poquito de unidad. And I went to actually talked to a Colombian priest who's in charge of the evangelical desk at the Pontifical Council for Promotion of Christian Unity, and I presented him with some of these ideas. He said, yeah, someone should do that. I mean, there's just so much work. I mean, it's in some ways overwhelming, but I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that's a very good suggestion you made.
So I have a question about Catholic unity.
Okay.
Now that you've talked about unity of Christians across the Catholic and Protestant boundary, and I'm thinking of the cathedral in San Salvador and the fact that the admirers of San Romero and the martyred Jesuits are sent to the basement of the church for his tomb, for their Bible study, and so forth. It gives a very concrete representation of the German distinction of die Kirche von oben and die Kirche von unten, the church from above and the church from below. And in that cathedral, it just so happens that most of the folks who are celebrating Mass in the basement and doing their Bible studies and coming to the tomb of Romero are from very low economic classes, from very low educational classes. And it strikes me that, it's a case of the official church barely tolerating, not welcoming, but barely tolerating the church from below. And it's an illustration of what I see as a particularly Catholic tendency to choose a group of fellow Catholics for exclusion, and to say those fellow Catholics, whether it's on a political issue, on a liturgical issue, on some other issue, to take a group of fellow Catholics and to designate them as not quite Catholic or not quite Catholic enough. And I wonder how much of a threat to the unity of the church in the Americas comes from the problems associated with Catholic unity.
Right. Catholics might want to read the Gospel from time to time. Is this the same cathedral that had the facade designed by Fernando Yort, by any chance? No, it's a different one in El Salvador. Oh, okay. No, I mean, I think... that was the first... your comment, your insightful comment, provokes two thoughts that came to me after absorbing this surprising announcement of Pope Francis's election. One was maybe Romero can get the canonization process can go on, because the intra-Catholic debate has to do with the definition of martyria, and he's a martyr for justice. Was he a martyr for faith? Some of the president of the Romero Foundation came to World Catholicism Week last year and spoke to that issue. And he couldn't really report officially because it's all kind of hush-hush, but he thought that Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, was open to moving that along, and that there were other more conservative voices that were still afraid of Romero's legacy in the sense that you just described in San Salvador. So I had this hope that maybe Pope Francis could just really make a big difference on that. That would be a great gift to the global church. Clearly it's not just Salvadoran, that would be a great gift to the global church. That just moving that along. But up from the basement and liturgical divisions and polemics, this is something that we experience in the United States all the time. There's right-wing Catholic newspapers, left-wing Catholic newspapers. There's divided churches, there's Latino. This is not San Salvador. This is in LA, I'm sure, certainly in Chicago, where Latinos worship in the basement and they have to just stay out of the way, be quiet, you're fine. So that's the challenge, that if we profess to be Christian, if we profess that this is Thanksgiving to God, we're the people to come together, it doesn't have to be, this is my own perspective on the liturgical question, it doesn't have to be a melded liturgy, 50% English. There's different styles here. The experts in Latino theology work on liturgy. Raul Gomez and others have addressed this issue. Eduardo Fernandez and Santa Clara have addressed this issue with great perspicacity and wisdom. There's different styles, but no, to be in ecclesia, this is a basic teaching from, my first answer about the gospel was really, I think, the main point. The basic teaching about ecclesia is it has to be one body of Christ. That's why Raul and I, when we did that volume in '98, entitled it Cuerpo de Cristo, because we felt this was the future of the U.S. Catholic Church. But so, thank you for that comment.
Time for one more question. Anyone last? All right,
please, Victoria.
First, an observation just from someone who is very interested in Catholic and Christian history and also in liturgy. I would say that we had an example in the installation celebration in Rome of both the beauty and un poquito de unidad, when you have particularly the latter from the linguistic standpoint. The reason that when my eyes flew open at 1:30 I turned on the computer was because I'd read that the gospel was going to be read in Greek. And the readings were in English and Spanish, the two most widely spoken Western international languages, leaving aside Mandarin or any other Indian language, and then Greek, our earliest liturgical language after perhaps Aramaic. And the beauty, I think, particularly of the robes that the Greek deacon was wearing from one of the Eastern Catholic churches, I thought really stood out as well. So those were, I think, that was just an observation. But as a question, in this era of the new evangelization, which I think we can be confident that the new Pope is going to continue to give great importance to, is there any reevaluation of the evangelization of the Americas and Asia and Africa even, that, for lack of a better word, second evangelization, colonial evangelization, is any of that being reconsidered or re-examined in light of the more the historical aspects of it in light of the new evangelization?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Victoria. I mean, I think most of the focus has been on the newness and the challenges of newness, new in its form, new in its method, new in its ardor, and then reaching out to young people, reaching out to Latin America, where there is this big concern about the rise of Pentecostalism, dealing with ethnic strife, tribalism in Africa, dealing with religious difference in Asia. I have many colleagues, so I don't, on the official level, I don't, in the Vatican, which now is under the microscope for reform, I don't know if there are groups thinking. I mean, certainly Enrique Dussel does when he writes about Descubrimiento de America. He says this is not Columbus, this heroic individual, but this is an uncovering of a layer of reality. Descubrimiento. And Thea has that same idea in the quote I read about superimposition. So, I mean, I think the two have to go hand in hand. A kind of purification of memory to see and here in California, of course, this is your own reality, to see the violence that attended the initial evangelization, and then to see how now with a Franciscan Pope, methods of peace, the methods of reconciliation, and a genuine new mestizaje can emerge alongside the new evangelization. So, I mean, I have colleagues, my colleague Emmanuel Colombo works on Jesuit missions to Muslim countries, and has written, now writing his fourth book on the kind of historical period, the early modern period. So there is some really good research available about the problems of enculturization. I mean, the other dimension that might rise to the fore, again, we're just prognosticating. I mean, he's only been in the papacy for a few days, but I mean, his Ignatian spirituality has been kind of a welcome by, even by Buff, and unsuspected kind of welcoming of his Ignatian spirituality. Because it has this Franciscan accent. So that quote I read from the 2007 interview says that to remain obedient in faith to the Lord is to recognize that you can never stay still, that you have the sense of being sent. In the past, that meant that people from Europe and North America, I think of the Irish, for example, would be sent to Africa, Asia, and Latin America, sent down to deal with the third world. My friend Emmanuel Katongole, who teaches at Notre Dame, the priest from the Diocese of Kampala, brilliant theologian, was asked by the Cardinal Archbishop of Kampala to be in charge of the Ugandan missionaries to the United States. I mean, mission now, the sense of the Ignatian spirituality of mission, the church's concept of mission, is not going from the north to the south. It's going in every possible direction at once. And my intuition is that this Franciscan Jesuit, this coincidence of opposites, an enigmatic figure from Buenos Aires, might have some inkling about how that could continue to develop. But we'll have to see.
Peter, thank you. I wanted to thank Peter for his wonderful presentation, especially in these early days of the new papacy. All of you for being here. We have some old friends who I've seen before. We have some new friends from LMU and Fuller that are here with us. And I just want to close by offering the resources that we produce at the Institute, which are to tackle these questions in an interdisciplinary form as well as the interreligious form. Our last speaker of the spring will be Bruce Zuckerman, speaking on technology and the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have a card about that speech up here. Feel free to peruse all of our books here when you have a chance. I'm going to put a stack of free books out in the back if you want. That gives a great sense of the sort of scholars that the Institute wants to engage to think about these questions in a big way. The book is actually an edited collection of talks given in receipt of the Marianist Award at the University of Dayton, and it includes David Tracy, Charles Taylor, Gustavo Gutierrez, a whole number of folks. I believe recently deceased anthropologist. Is Mary Douglas in there as well? So a real kind of wonderful, heavy thinkers of how we can bring the realms of faith and reason together in new and important ways. And then finally, I'll just put out a shout for next fall. We think we're gonna have Paul Ely, who has written some big books on in kind of Catholic literature, as well as Richard Madsen, a sociologist from UC San Diego, good friends with Robert Bella, who will speak on Catholics in China in the fall. So keep us in mind, check out our website, and please be in contact with me if you'd like to know more. But thanks to all of you, and thanks to Peter. Have a good day.